I want you to picture the scene for a second. It is August 1992, Reading Festival over in the UK. And if you have ever been to a British music festival, you know exactly what it looks like.
Oh, yeah. Rain, mud baths, tents, just completely flooding, miserable conditions.
Right, just totally miserable. But the atmosphere in this specific crowd isn't just heavy because of the weather. It is heavy because the rumor mill is absolutely on fire.
It was at fever pitch. And you really have to remember, this is pre-Twitter, right? Pre-Reddit. Rumors didn't just trend for an hour and then vanish. They hung in the air like fog. And the stories circulating about the headliners that night were, well, they were dark.
Yeah, everyone in that crowd basically knew or thought they knew three things. One, the band is breaking up. Two, the lead singer is overdosing. Or three, worst of all, he is already dead.
Exactly. I mean, the music press had been running these brutal, relentless stories for months about heroin use, internal fighting, emergency hospital visits. So when the lights finally go down for Nirvana, the crowd is literally holding its breath.
They don't know if they're about to see a concert or a funeral.
Right. And then onto the stage rolls.
A wheelchair.
A wheelchair. It is, without a doubt, one of the greatest pieces of theater in rock history. You have Kurt Cobain, the biggest rock star on the planet, sitting in a wheelchair wearing a hospital gown and this long blonde wig.
And he fully commits to the bit. He doesn't just sit there.
Oh, no, he looks terrible. He purposefully looks like he is on his last legs. And then Chris Novoselic, the bass player, grabs the mic and delivers this incredibly solemn eulogy. He says something like, it's too painful, but with the help of his friends and family, he is going to make it.
The crowd must have been so incredibly confused. And then Kurt tries to stand up. He reaches for the mic stand, sings like one single line of a Bette Midler song, and just face plants.
Collapses.
Dead center stage.
And for a split second, the audience thinks, oh my God, it's real. We just watched him die. But then
he leaps up.
He grabs his guitar, the band kicks straight into the song Breed, and they proceed to absolutely tear the place down.
It is the ultimate gotcha moment.
It really was a giant middle finger. To the critics, to the rumors, to the whole idea that they were finished. It was triumphant.
And that is exactly where we are starting today. Bert.
Glad to be here.
Today we are doing a deep dive into the source material surrounding Nirvana. But we are not just doing the standard greatest hits biography. Our mission today is to look at the specific human elements that built this band, and eventually, the elements that broke it.
Because when you really dig into the sources, the biographies, the first-hand accounts, you realize that Reading Festival moment wasn't just a prank. It was a mask.
Yeah.
Nirvana wasn't this sturdy, unstoppable machine. It was a very specific, volatile chemistry built on a very shaky foundation.
So let's get off the stage at Reading and go back to the mud where this actually started, because you really can't understand the explosion without understanding the soil it grew out of. And that soil is Aberdeen, Washington.
Right. And calling it soil is being generous. By the time Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic were coming up, Aberdeen was a dying logging town. It was geographically isolated, it was economically depressed, and culturally it was stuck in the past.
Yeah, one of the descriptions in our research really stuck with me. It's that you basically had three options if you grew up in Aberdeen. You could be athletic, you could be creative and get completely shunned, or you could be into music and also get shunned.
And Kurt was firmly in that shunned category. He was an outcast. But what is so fascinating here isn't just that he was lonely, it is how that isolation forced him to be creative. He didn't have access to a fancy studio or top-tier gear. He had to use whatever was lying around.
But he did record, right? Even back in those early days.
He did. He had this intense drive to document everything. He would go over to his Aunt Marie's house. She was one of the few people who really supported his creative side. And she had a teak 4-track reel-to-reel recorder.
Okay, so he has a recorder, but what about the instruments? He didn't have a drummer yet, so did he just use a drum machine?
See, this is where you really see the artist in him early on. Aunt Marie actually offered him a drum machine. She told him, here, use this. It keeps perfect time. And Kurt refused.
Why? I mean, that seems like the easiest solution.
He wanted purity. He thought a machine sounded too fake, too polished.
So what is the alternative? Just banging on a desk?
Close. He raided her closet. He pulled out a pink Samsonite suitcase.
You are kidding. A literal suitcase.
A pink Samsonite suitcase. And then he went into the kitchen and grabbed a pair of wooden spoons. That was his percussion section.
That is just incredible dedication to a specific sound.
It is resourcefulness over resources. He wanted that raw, clunky, physical sound, and he did not care if he looked ridiculous getting it. That sonic texture, that absolute refusal to be polished, that is the seed of grunge right there.
And I imagine that kind of weird, raw energy attracts other outsiders.
It does. He eventually fell in with the Melvins. Now, for those who don't know, the Melvins were basically the punk rock godfathers of the Pacific Northwest. Buzz Osborne, their singer, was the guy. He was the punk evangelist, introducing everyone to records you literally could not buy in a place like Aberdeen.
And Kurt was just a fan in the crowd.
Worse, he was a Klingon. That is what they called him.
Oh, man.
Yeah, he and his friends would just hang around the Melvins rehearsals, desperate to be close to the music.
That is deeply humbling. The guy who would become the voice of a generation started out as a groupie called a Klingon.
Everyone starts somewhere. But this is where the most important partnership actually begins. Kurt knew Chris Novoselic, but they were not in a band together yet. Chris was a big guy, kind of goofy, but he had a van, which, in the world of local music, makes you an absolute king.
Right, transportation's everything. So how did they actually link up musically? Did they just jam one day in the van?
No, it wasn't a jam session, it was an artifact. Kurt gave Chris a demo tape of his solo project. It was called Fecal Matter.
Charming title.
Very on brand for the punk scene. Specifically, the tape was called Illiteracy Will Prevail. Kurt gave it to Chris, hoping he would listen to it. And Chris,
Let me guess, he lost it.
he just didn't listen to it. Not for a long time.
That is terrifying to think about.
Yeah.
The whole history of modern rock music is just sitting in the back of Chris Novoselic's car, and he is ignoring it.
Pretty much. But eventually he finally plays it, and amidst all the noise and the distortion and the suitcase drumming, he hears something.
Was it a specific song that caught his ear?
It was a track called Spank Through.
Spank Through.
Okay. Yeah. But here is the key takeaway from the sources. It had a melody. Beneath the sludge and the noise, there was a genuine, catchy pop hook. That is what Chris heard. He realized, wait, this isn't just noise. This guy can actually write a song. That was the turning point. He went to Kurt and said, let's start a band.
It sounds like a partnership born out of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
Just two guys in a town with no other options, trying to build a ladder to climb out.
Exactly. But they were still missing the engine. They went through a few different drummers, but nobody really clicked. They needed that final piece of the puzzle.
Enter Dave Grohl. But looking at the timeline in our research, Dave wasn't even in the same state, was he?
No, he was in a Washington, D.C. hardcore band called Scream. They were touring, and the band basically imploded while they were in Los Angeles. Dave was stranded, broke, and a mutual friend told him to call these guys up in the Pacific Northwest.
So he calls Chris.
He calls Chris, and this is a detail that people often forget. Chris initially rejected him.
Wait, really? He turned down Dave Grohl?
He did. He told him on the phone, sorry, we actually got Dan Peters. Now, Dan Peters was the drummer for Mudhoney. In the Seattle scene, that is basically royalty.
So Dave must have thought, well, that's it. Opportunity missed.
Right. But then later, that exact same night, Chris calls him back.
What changed his mind so quickly?
Chris and Kurt had a conversation. They realized that while Dan Peters was an amazing drummer, he was what they called a 60s rudimental style drummer.
Okay, I am not a musician. What does rudimental mean in this specific context? Is that like jazz?
Think technical. Precision, rolls, snares, a very loose swinging feel. It is complex playing. But Kurt and Chris realized that wasn't what Nirvana needed. They did not need technical perfection.
What did they need?
As Chris put it in the interviews, they needed Dave's simplistic Neanderthal disco dynamic.
Neanderthal disco. I absolutely love that description.
It is perfect, isn't it? It implies something primitive, heavy, hitting hard. That is the Neanderthal part. But with a groove that makes people want to move and dance, that is the disco part. That combination is the true Nirvana sound.
But for Dave, this wasn't an easy yes, was it? Even after Chris called him back.
No, it wasn't. He was agonizing over the decision. He felt like he was betraying his friends and Scream. These guys were his brothers. He was stuck in this intense moral dilemma of loyalty versus opportunity.
I read in the source material that he actually called his mom for advice.
He did. Picture this. He is standing in a random parking lot, calling his mom collect from a payphone. And she gives him this advice that, frankly, changed the course of music history. She told him, David, I know you love your friends, but sometimes you have to put your needs ahead of others.
Wow. That's such a powerful permission to be selfish.
Permission to survive, really, from a woman who was known for being incredibly selfless. And with that blessing, he packed his entire drum set into a single cardboard box, which tells you how little he actually owned, and he moved north.
So now we have the trio, the The chemistry is locked in, the Neanderthal disco is happening, they record Nevermind, and suddenly, almost overnight, they aren't just three weird guys from Aberdeen anymore. They're the biggest band on the planet.
And this is where the story shifts. Because our deep dive today isn't about the chart positions or the record sales, it is about the pressure cooker they were suddenly living in.
Yeah, the recording of Nevermind itself seemed to have some major warning signs, even before the massive fame hit.
Absolutely. The producer of that album, Butch Vig, talked extensively about Kurt's mood swings in the studio. He said Kurt would just shut down. He would go sit in a corner for hours, completely unreachable, a total blackout. And then, snap, he would jump up, yell, "Let's go," and be perfectly ready to record a vocal take for Lithium.
That volatility was baked in right from the start. But then you add fame, and you add money to that mix.
Money is the great divider, and the royalties dispute is really the ugly scar on the band's internal history.
What exactly happened there?
Well, initially the publishing split was even among the three of them, but once the massive money started rolling in, Kurt wanted to renegotiate. He decided he wanted 75% of the songwriting royalties.
Which, to be fair, he did write the core of the songs. That happens in a lot of bands.
True, but he wanted it applied retroactively to Nevermind.
Oh, so he was actively taking money out of Dave and Chris's pockets for work they had already completed.
Exactly, and that changed the dynamic on the tour bus immediately. It went from us against the world, a band of brothers, to you work for me. Chris and Dave were deeply hurt by that. You can imagine the tension sitting in that tiny dressing room night after night.
And then you add the external pressure, the media scrutiny, the Vanity Fair article.
Right, the Vanity Fair piece was the nuclear bomb. They ran a profile where Courtney Love was quoted admitting to using heroin while she was pregnant.
That must have been completely catastrophic for them personally.
It was. It triggered a child services investigation. They were suddenly fighting for custody of their newborn daughter, Frances Bean, almost immediately after she was born. Kurt was enraged. He felt persecuted by the media. He felt hunted.
Which brings us all the way back to that reading festival moment we started with. The wheelchair, the hospital gown.
Right. Now you see it differently. It wasn't just a funny rock star joke. It was a defense mechanism. It was a giant middle finger to the journalists who he felt were trying to take his child away.
There was that one detail from the set list, too, about the song More Than a Feeling.
Yes. I love that detail. The critics had been writing that Smells Like Teen Spirit was just a ripoff of the riff from Boston's More Than a Feeling. So at Reading, right before playing Teen Spirit, Kurt purposefully plays the opening riff of More Than a Feeling.
Just openly mocking them.
Mocking them directly. And then he got the massive crowd to chant, "Courtney, we love you."
That feels like such a high point in their story. A moment where they faced down the rumors and conquered their demons on stage. Dave Grohl even said later that the show healed us for a little while.
But a little while is the operative phrase there, because the tragedy of this deep dive is that the healing simply did not last. The timeline starts to accelerate very quickly after this, toward the end.
Right. We are moving into early 1994, the unraveling.
It starts in Rome, March 1994. Kurt is found unconscious in his hotel. At the time, the management team spun the story. They said, oh, he drank some champagne and took a Rohypnol. It was just a terrible accident.
But the sources confirm it wasn't an accident.
No. It was a suicide attempt. He left a note. He was specifically saying in the note that he refused to go through another divorce.
It is haunting how clear the signs were looking back at the timeline. And the people around him really did try to stop it, right? There was an intervention.
There was. On March 25th, a surprise intervention at Kurt's home in Seattle. It was everyone, Courtney, the bandmates, the management team. And the sources say it was not a calm, supportive conversation. It was desperate. Courtney threatened divorce. The band threatened to break up entirely. They were basically holding a gun to his career and his marriage, saying, get help right now, or this is all over.
And initially, he listened. He checked into the Exodus Recovery Center down in L.A.
He did, and the reports from those first couple of days in rehab are so confusingly normal. He was cooperative. He hung out and played with his daughter, Frances. The nanny said he seemed okay.
But clearly, he felt trapped.
He must have, because he didn't formally check out. He scaled a 6-foot brick wall surrounding the facility.
He just climbed over the wall and ran.
Climbed over, went straight to the airport, and flew back to Seattle. He was a ghost. No one knew exactly where he was. And this is where the timeline gets to the detail about the gun.
Right. He met up with his friend, Dylan Carlson.
Yes. Kurt asked Dylan to buy him a shotgun. And the excuse he gave to his friend, it is so mundane. He said he needed protection against trespassers at his property.
And Dylan just believed him.
Why wouldn't he? Kurt was incredibly famous. He literally had fans and stalkers climbing his fences all the time. It was a very plausible reason. So they went together to a place called Stan Baker Sports and bought the shotgun.
We don't need to dwell on the act itself today. The world knows what happened next. But I really want to focus on the aftermath, because one of the most powerful things in the research is Chris Novoselic's recollection of those days right after Kurt was found.
This is the part of the source material that really stays with you. Chris isn't speaking as a rock star in these interviews. He is speaking as a guy who just lost his best friend. He talks about going to the funeral home for a private viewing.
And this wasn't the big public vigil at the Seattle Center. This was just for the immediate family and the band.
Correct. It was a closed room. Chris describes walking in and seeing Kurt's body. And he mentions this very small, devastating detail. The funeral home had folded a kerchief over Kurt's forehead and eyes to hide the damage.
God, that image is just heavy.
And Chris sat there next to him and held his hand. And what he remembers most vividly is the temperature. He talks about how cold Kurt's hand felt.
That sensory memory just gets burned in.
It haunted him. He said he went home that night and stood at his bathroom sink for ages, just scrubbing his hands with soap and hot water. He was trying to wash the cold off his skin, but he couldn't get the sensation to leave.
That is just heartbreaking. It brings the whole story down from the myth of the rock legend to just a fragile human body.
And then the universe plays this incredibly cruel joke on him.
On the drive home.
Yeah. Chris is driving home, alone in his car, totally in shock. He turns on the radio just to have some background noise to fill the silence. And of all the songs in the world that could have been playing, the Pixies come on.
Do we know which song?
Break My Body?
No. You are kidding me.
I wish I was. The lyrics are literally, break my body, hold my bones. Chris said he had a full-blown panic attack right there in the driver's seat. He just completely lost it.
It is almost too perfect of a tragedy.
Yeah.
It feels scripted, but it's real life.
It is. And you know, when we normally talk about Nirvana, we talk about the millions of records sold, the flannel shirts taking over fashion, the whole voice of a generation label. But when you strip all the mythology away, what are you actually left with?
You are left with those two guys in the van.
Exactly. You're left with Kurt and Chris sitting in a little half house in Aberdeen, just two bored guys dreaming of escaping a town that didn't want them in the first place. They were just trying to get out.
And they did. They got out in the biggest way humanly possible.
But the tragedy is that the things that fueled their escape, that intense sensitivity, that raw nerve ending that Kurt exposed in his songwriting, those were the exact same things that made surviving the destination impossible for him.
You know, there is an interesting note in our sources about geography that I think is really important to mention here at the end.
Yeah.
We always associate Nirvana with Seattle, the Seattle sound. But the research suggests that's not quite accurate.
It's really not. Seattle gets all the glory and the grunge tourism. But Olympia, which is a smaller, much artsier college town nearby, that was their true spiritual home. That is where they lived during their absolute creative peak. That is where most of Nevermind was written. Olympia was the incubator. Seattle was just the stage they happened to play on when they blew up.
It is a really good reminder that the scene we see in the media is often very different from the reality on the ground.
Absolutely. And as we close out this deep dive, I keep thinking about the duality we have been discussing today. You have the Kurt, who is planking the world at Reading Festival. Vibrant, funny, resilient. And then you have the aftermath. That 1,000-yard stare that people noticed in Chris Novoselic for years afterward.
It really is two sides of the exact same coin. The joy of the noise and the silence that follows.
It raises a really provocative question for me, though. We tend to look at music history as inevitable. Like Nirvana was always destined to be huge. But was it?
What do you mean by that?
Think about the Neanderthal disco. If Chris hadn't picked up the phone and called Dave Grohl back that specific night, if they had stuck with the technical jazz-style drummer instead, doesn't Nevermind hit the culture the exact same way?
Or go back even further. What if Chris hadn't finally listened to that fecal matter tape? What if he just tossed it in the backseat of his van and completely forgot about it?
That is a wild thought to leave on. The angst of Aberdeen might have just stayed in Aberdeen.
Might never have heard a single note.
It all hinged on a cheap cassette tape, a pink Samsonite suitcase, and a collect call from a random parking lot.
That is something to think about. And that does it for our deep dive into the rise and fall of Nirvana. It is a heavy story, but those small details, the wooden spoons, the cold hand, the phone calls, they really make the legend feel human again. Thanks for exploring the sources with us. We will see you on the next deep dive.